Excuse me, are you Martin Jones, the writer of George Melville and the End of Time?
Yeah.
Is it possible I could ask you a few questions, please?
Well, I'm sort of reading at the moment.
Won't take long, I promise. It's just really important.
Well, all right, better sit down then, eh?
Thank you. Look, Martin, can I call you that?
Yes, by all means, yeah.
I need to tell you something. I've hired a small studio for us to go to after you've eaten. If you don't mind, just for me to ask you a series of questions about
You've hired a studio?
Get to know you a little better.
You've hired a studio?
Not far around the corner. Don't worry. Yeah, it's okay.
It's a bit weird, but all right then.
Okay, it will help you, I promise.
I believe you. I believe you.
Oh, but can I ask you a few questions here? Now?
Go on then.
So, who are you and why did you become a writer?
Oh God, who am I? Martin Jones. People know me as Mad Dog for various reasons. I play trumpet. I sing. I'm a band leader, jazz musician. I am an educator, and yes, you're quite right. Thank you very much. I am a writer as well, yeah.
How did the idea of the first book come about?
Well, the first book I wrote was a book about murder, and it just came into my head. I tried a long while to write a book, and I couldn't do it. I just didn't have the memory for an autobiography. So I thought, what I want to write is something like Biggles, or something in the 30s, a spy story, searching for treasure. So the characters that came into my head in the first book, which I didn't publish, I quite liked. George Melville, Dodge. So I thought I'll use them and a few others and create a story out of that. So that's how I did it.
Why didn't you publish it?
I hadn't ever. It was just the first book. This mystery murder. Because it wasn't the book I wanted to write. To be honest with you, it was like a retirement plan. I thought I would write a successful series of books, make millions of pounds, retire. But unfortunately, another 7 million people had the same idea and flooded the market, which meant that it was very difficult to get published, but I did self-publish my book.
When did you realise that, your characters that you created had their own identity within these books?
I think, basically, all writers discover that. They become real people in their head. They have their own characters, their own history, their own identity, they know what they want. But I realised fairly quickly, to be quite honest.
My last question, how did the narrative of these books progress?
In an unusual direction. I set out the stories, and then the characters went in a completely different direction. I didn't expect them to be linked to statues 2,000 years ago as Tibetan monks. I sort of was quite annoyed at first. I put quite a lot of effort in planning. And then, for example, the second book, they ended up being reincarnated each time they died because they were part of something called the Hand of Destiny. Well, that came from, I have no idea. They're my books, but no idea at all.
Hello, welcome to today's show. We have a special guest, the world-famous author Martin Jones, the author of the George Melville mystery books. Hello, how are we today?
Well, I'm fine, how are you?
I'm absolutely amazing, thank you. So heading on to the first question, at what point did you, have this unusual influence on what you'd written?
Unusual influence. Well, I suppose there was an unusual influence. All right then, so I am very organised, meticulously so, because basically I have a dreadful memory as a result of the life I've led. So I planned very carefully the first few books, but the characters inside my head had no intention of following my advice and went on their own merry way. I planned meticulously the books I was writing. I would always write in the middle of the night because I only ever have 4 hours sleep. And so I'd plan all the plot, etc. And then the characters became very dominant inside my head, as strange as it might sound, and ignored completely what my plans were. And the books ended up being what they were always going to be, until the point where I just didn't bother. It wasn't like automatic writing, I was thinking it, but it always ended up being a surprise in the end where we'd ended up.
Heading into the first excerpt of your first book, The Mask of Perpetuity.
Right, yes, by all means. Welcome, Mr. Melville. You've arrived just in time, the German said in perfect English. He pointed to the spare seat, and in the absence of any other conceivable plan, I decided to sit where I was directed. The game is Texas Hold'em, Mr. Melville. The wild cards and the ante is 82,000 Hong Kong dollars, he told me, without any apparent humour, as the table was cleared of cards and chips from the last game. My heart sank, and I looked to Mad Dog for some indication of what to do. He just looked at me like an idiot. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Herr, whatever your name is. I have come here to purchase an antiquity which was illegally stolen from His Majesty's government, and whatever I happen to have on me will only leave my protection once I have the antiquity, I said, with as much confidence I could produce under the circumstances. It is you that has things wrong, Mr. Melville. The Mask of Perpetuity is safe in Ireland under our control. No, the money you have in your money clip, Mr. Melville, is for this game of chance, and if you win, you will escape with your life, without the money, of course. That was always going to be ours. If you lose the game, I'm afraid you and your Scottish friend will end up as shark bait in the waters beneath the casino. Now, shall we play? He said, holding his hand out for the money. I looked around the table in disbelief. What kind of secret service were we running? My fate completely in the hands of a Scottish lunatic alcoholic, and my reputation on the line when I returned without the mask. That's if I returned at all. I looked at Mad Dog and shouted, "Well, Mr. Secret Agent, what do we do now?" He just looked at me with a gormless face, and even though it was the last thing I wanted to do, cognizant as I was of Tweedledum and Tweedledee's hands reaching for their guns, I found the clip of the money and threw it onto the table. "Excellent! Could we have some chips for Mr. Melville, please?" he asked one of the brothers as he pocketed the money, and a stack of chips arrived in front of me. "The only bet, Mr. Melville, is all in, and if you win the game, you and your Scottish laird will be escorted off our premises with our best wishes to your chiefs, who will no doubt be pleased to have you safe. If you lose, Mr. Melville, your deaths will be most painful indeed, I'm afraid," he said, easily managing to hide any sign of genuine regret in his voice. I looked at Mad Dog and said, "You'll pay for this." I pushed all the chips to the centre, and the cards were then dealt, and desperately trying to remember how to play it from my time in the war with American troops in France, I looked at my 7 and the 2 of clubs, with rising horror. No one else bet, and all eyes were on me as the flop was dealt, which was Jack of clubs, 2 of hearts, and 6 of clubs. If my memory served me correctly, I was in with a chance of achieving a flush if another club surfaced, which I seemed to think was quite a decent hand. The German sat impassively, his hands resting on his cards, which, like mine, were face down. The turn card was dealt, and my heart sank. A 3 of diamonds. I could feel sweat dripping off my face onto the pristine green baize. The terrible twins, almost in synchronized motion, both took their lugers out of their holsters and placed them on the baize. The final card dropped on the baize like a death threat. The 6 of clubs glared at me with an arrogance which was shocking. And then I realized I'd been saved. I got the flush with the river. With a sense of extraordinary relief, I slowly, with a huge smile on my face, showed my cards to the general sense of amazement around the room. My German opponent, who sat and still hadn't revealed his name, looked at me and smiled. I knew then I was dead. Slowly, so agonizingly slowly, he turned his cards face up, and facing me was a Jack of diamonds and a 6 of spades. He had a full house, 6s over jacks. I went suddenly very cold in spite of the heat. A mad dog moaned a long, piteous sound. "Sadly, you lose, Mr. Melville," the German said, with a gloss of obvious satisfaction resurfacing the hardness of his face, while smiling a flash of gold, which completed the finishing touches to his artistic picture of happiness.
So, on to the next question. Did you purposefully set up the science fiction book in your last book, Armageddon?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, not at the beginning. For me, the last book was always going to be about World War II and action scenes. And I'd set up this evil gang called the Bengal Quince Organisation. And I just thought it was a bit like a Bond sort of, evil gang. And then all of a sudden it became Baal, the Prince of Darkness, a demon from hell. And I was just thinking, God, this is weird. And I was still writing it. I was quite enjoying it. And then all of a sudden the characters ended up in limbo and they got rescued. And I thought, well, if they've been in limbo, something needs to happen to them. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? Not that I've been there myself. So basically, I thought, well, let's make them immortal. And I think, as I continued to write, it suddenly occurred to me, because I've always been interested in science fiction, Asimov, Orson Scott Card, Ray Bradbury, all those great writers. I always wanted to really write a huge landscape, a saga of a science fiction book. And it occurred to me, instead of trying to find new characters, I had ready-made characters. And I think by that point I was already thinking perhaps that it could go into science fiction. And then it occurred to me I could bring something from another reality, because I wanted to really expand on big theories and concepts. So I brought in the character called Seymour, which is a little circular sort of computer thing from a dystopian future. And from that moment on, I think I was certain that it was going to lead on to the science fiction novel, yes.
Oh, okay. Moving on to the second excerpt from your second book, The Hand of Destiny.
Thank you.
They walked outside and were astonished to see not one soul about at all. Eventually, as they walked into a town, a boy dressed in rags and was playing with a stick on some railings. "Hello, where is everyone? Why is there no one here?" Dodds asked. "You know nothing.
I know much more than you, he boasted, looking very pleased with himself. We agree, but we'll give you a gold coin if you tell us what's going on. Do you like my English? My father spent 10 years in England, and he made sure we could all speak it, he said, seemingly oblivious to our comment. Your English is very good. To prove it, you could tell us what is going on. Where can we get a taxi for Santa Chura? That is a very bad idea, my friends. You are my friends, aren't you? He looked, looking suddenly worried. Swallowing his impatience, Dodge then said, Of course we're your friends. Friends look after each other, don't they? Why is it a bad idea to go to Satichura? Dodge asked very patiently. Because tonight there's going to be a war. There's a general strike, which is only why no one is about. But everyone knows there's going to be one hell of a fight at the palace, and no one in their right mind would want to go there tonight, unless they wanted to get killed, he said, and laughed at them. Dodds and Yvonne looked at each other and grimaced. Dodds thought to himself, why is it never just easy and simple? Look, we've got 3 gold coins, Dodds said while holding them up, glinting in the late sun in front of the boy. These 3 gold coins will be yours if you find someone to take us there. Our friend is imprisoned there, and we have come to rescue him, Dodds told him. There are no adults here, but I know where there is a car full of petroleum, and for 3 gold coins, I'll drive you there myself. They looked at him in horror, but couldn't think what else to do. They followed him through dusty, deserted streets to a garage, and after a short while they saw the boy enter and then leave the house. Sit in front of the seat of a car, place short planks of wood under his feet so he could reach the pedals. The car was an old Ford Model A, and rust covered most of the exterior. They sat in the back, doubting the car would actually start, and then suddenly they were thrown against the back restraints as the car burst into life and the boy sped off at a ridiculous speed. Slow down, they both shouted, but the boy said, If your friend is imprisoned, then he's being killed tonight. I heard my father talking about it. Something about games and tigers. My father worked for the Maharaja, but he has left his employ. He was an evil man. In that case, step on it, they shouted, and the car fired out of Campor like a bullet down the deserted streets, but Dodds and Yvonne's eyes tightly closed as they narrowly avoided walls, telegraph poles, and street signs in their way out to what they hoped would be the mountain palace of Satichura.
Could you please enlighten our viewers as to where your books are available?
With the greatest of pleasure, yes. So, available in all the usual shops, Amazon, but there is a website you can access all of this, plus other material as well, which is www.wordofdog.co.uk. I might say my stage name is Mad Dog, so that makes more sense.
Heading on to the next pep set from Martin Jones' book, which is The Emerald Tablet of the Seven Sermons of the Dead.
The eeriness of the flickering torch on the ceiling and dank walls was disturbing. Full wall paintings taken from the Crusades were everywhere, with one wall in particular featuring a number of Knights Templar. With their characteristic red and white St. George's Cross of England on their shields and capes immediately standing out. There was text which Dodds couldn't begin to recognise all across the low-ceilinged room, and the temperature ensured they could see each other's breath. Aren't the choirs scared to practice here, Vicar? And isn't it too cold? Yvonne asked, and the vicar chuckled. They rehearse here during the summer, when it's not as cold. They love being down here. They imagine they are Knights Templar themselves, and the acoustics are quite wonderful, I'm told, he replied, smiling to himself. What we are really looking for, then, is a sign or picture showing 2 riders in armour riding together on horseback. Also useful would be if you saw a picture of a temple or church, or the words Christi de Templo or militum, or sigillum, the professor said enthusiastically. They lit more torches which lit up the murky and damped crypt, and they split up into 3 parties. Yvonne and Dodds went to the nearest wall with many paintings and writing on it and started their meticulous search. The wall was covered in paintings of knights fighting in presumably the Crusades and monks praying, with a lot of text which plainly bore no relation to English, neither ancient nor modern. They moved to another wall and began searching there. They searched for an hour, and they began to despair of finding anything. Dodd sat down and looked at what may strangely once have been a fireplace, and looked up to the amazing design which went up the wall into the ceiling, and he realized the ceiling was full of Old English text, and in the middle near the far wall there was a sign of both the 2 horsemen and the text they were looking for, with a sword pointing to just around the middle of the wall where it met the floor. "Look, it's pointing to the middle of this wall," Dodge shouted. "Oh, I say, well done. I think you found the entrance, dear boy," the professor said excitedly. The wall and that part of the floor were crumbly and not substantial, and with all their concerted efforts they broke through, and in the dim light they could just about make out a staircase chiselled out of the bare rock, descending down into a huge blackness beyond. As they walked down, they could hear water running, and they moved slowly, marvelling at the hundreds of stalactites and stalagmites, all poised to drip on their moisture from the cave roof. At the bottom there were several chairs chiselled out of rock, with the 8th raised above them as if for their leader. The professor moved to the nearest wall and said, "How extraordinary! This text is Latin, and if I can just make this out," the professor said mysteriously. She walked forward to the far wall, which was covered in text and strange markings, and she read out, "For the part that is hidden and the path to more, only blind faith will lead you. The cross that stands at last in the Holy Land, with God's blessing, will show you the way," she read out to our amazement. She thought for a second. The Holy Land, a cross that stands at last. It must mean the Jerusalem cross, she whispered breathlessly. "What does a Jerusalem cross look like, Professor?" Dodds asked her. "Oh, I suppose it's like 4-letter T's meeting in the middle, with 4 simple black crosses and the spaces making a square. That's the best description I could think of." They then started their search, and soon enough, behind the raised chair, they found a huge panel with a Jerusalem cross plainly painted on it. "What do we do now, Professor?" Dodds asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Smash it in, of course. That's why you need blind faith. Smash it in, dear boy," she shouted breathlessly. Dodds did precisely as she asked, and the picture and panel crumbled to reveal a deep recess inside. Everyone held their breath, and the air felt dry and aged. Dust particles hovered in the torchlight, as if caught outside in searchlights trying to escape. Dodds carefully brought the torch closer, and the first thing they saw was a fragment of what seemed at first to be part of a gravestone. But it was emerald green in parts, and more aged in others. The green caught the light, and it seemed quite otherworldly. "Oh my, it's true, it's the emerald tablet," the professor said, and Yvonne thought she was going to collapse with excitement. Dodds carefully pulled it out, and it was covered with ancient text, which Dodds could not make head nor tail of. It was very heavy and felt warm in his hand in spite of the cold. Also in the compartment was a map of sorts, written on parchment. It showed a map of Rue Neuve Notre Dame, which we presume was the Notre Dame in Paris. Towards the bottom right of the map, there was again the sign of the Jerusalem cross, which incredibly seemed to be more likely to be an X marks the spot.
So, Martin, what do you find is the easiest part of writing these books?
Well, it follows on from what I was saying before. I mean, the hardest part is doing all the research because it was set in the 1930s. The easiest part, strange enough, I know you read about the tortured writer, in writer's block, but the easiest part for me was just let the characters do the talking and just write it. Making sure that the characters are right in the period, the kind of decor, all the details that you would expect to see in a book of that era are there. So that was the hard bit, to be quite honest. So the easy bit was writing the book.
Okay. Moving on to our fourth excerpt, the Keystone to Enlightenment.
They made their way scrambling through warm, cloying leaves until they heard a conversation. Mad Dog translated. "Come on, Helga. The ceremony will be starting soon. We need to make sure we get seats," the young man was saying. "I really don't feel right about this water. In fact, this whole dig is wrong," she said, exasperatedly. "Don't let them hear that, Helga. You really will be in trouble then. What would your father think if you were sent back in disgrace?" "I know you're right. It's just there's a really odd feeling to this place, and it emanates from that altar. Come on, we shouldn't be late." And with that, Mad Dog and I just got out of the way before they both walked out, past us, and walked towards the centre of the dig. It was 11:16 p.m., and we had 4 minutes to wait before the diversion. Sadly, there were no clipboards or security passes available, but really the time had gone for that game, and Mad Dog had come up trumps when it mattered. There was a platoon which the Nazis called a Zug, taken from the 232nd Panzer Division of 39 soldiers who were attached to the dig. This was split, Mad Dog had estimated, with always 20 soldiers on site at all times. Pearson and Williams now had 8 men with them from Soma's nomads, so they had a chance to keep them pinned down for some time. Suddenly, on the other side of the dig, all hell broke loose, with explosions from grenade, mortar, and machine gun fire. The whole camp seemed to galvanize into action, with everyone running for weapons. We took immediate advantage of our diversionary tactics and slung our machine guns around our necks and ran in the general direction of the attack, which equally was the direction towards the altar. 15 minutes earlier, Jamgon knew it was about to begin. He felt the entity becoming more aware as well, and he had to be honest with himself that he really didn't know how this was going to work. Men came for him then and roughly carried him to the altar. He was stripped of his upper clothes and tied to the altar. He could feel the evil emanating out of it, and it sapped his energy. He looked up and the sky was black as coal. He felt help was with him, but he didn't feel enough. So he waited and meditated.
Where did the ideas of the characters come from? You know, reading the books myself, they seem very much alive.
Right. Well, it's good that you've read the books. That's somebody. Well, I think, with every writer, I'm sure the characters become alive, occupy their brain and are real people. And certainly in this book series, the characters did become real for me. They were like real friends. or at least associates, people I knew about and thought about, and something would happen and I would think how George Melville would react in that way, or Dodds or Mad Dog. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, they came. I mean, I don't know how they came about originally. They just popped in my head. I mean, I wrote a book first with these characters, and it was in a direction I didn't want to go at all. You know, I wanted to go a different direction, but the characters stayed with me, and when I eventually got on the right track in my sort of Biggles mode, chasing treasure, coursing around the world, having chasing treasure and being secret agents, dominated the book. They, as I've said, dominated the book, as I've said, and became very real. Sounds very odd. That's about the best I can say, really. Sounds very odd, but that is what happened, yeah.
Thank you. Heading on to our next excerpt, The Mummified Hand and the President.
The Kai Tai Taki in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, was a bar which Dodds had warmed to. The four huge fans did make some headway in the oppressive heat, and he was getting hooked on the Clarin cocktails. Clarin was a rough white rum, and the addition of the palm sugar and lime juice made it just about the only drink on the island to consume which didn't slowly kill you. He looked through the darkness of a hot dive of a bar onto a stunning sunset of violet indigo, turning slowly to magenta through to a vivid scarlet. The fluffy white clouds had a more orange tint, and the palm trees following down to the bay, kissed by a silver-edged turquoise, shimmering sea, just about made it one of the best views in the world. At last Yvonne joined him. She had been delayed, sending a report to head office for BM. It was hot, and they were covered in perspiration. He's not coming, she speculated, but Dodds remained silent and confident. They had arrived 3 days ago after a series of long trips by seaplane because BM's Haiti operative Charlie Townsend had gone missing. He had been at the point of discovering something big, according to his secretary, and then suspiciously BM had heard nothing else. Their first job had been to interview his secretary, Miss Tilly Watterson. She confirmed that he had been working on an investigation into a Fabien Baptiste, who was a French Haitian and owned the local voodoo shop. They were also told by Tilly that there had been a number of visits by a U.S. Senator, Harry Pratt from Philadelphia, and it seemed highly likely that there was something big going on. The last clue we had was that an Edouard Mars had been a source of information for Charlie. So that had been their first port of call. Edouard had proved to be elusive, but they managed to locate him just getting into a meeting earlier that day in a local hotel, and he agreed to see them. They mentioned this bar, and he knew it. He told them he would meet them there after sundown. Dodds looked around the room and saw the locals at play, drinking, dancing, flirting with each other. He began to realize that he really enjoyed it there. It was an uncomplicated lifestyle which appealed to him. It was just after they ordered another round of Clarin cocktails and they managed at last to get a seat outside at a table overlooking the bay when he arrived. Dodds looked at Yvonne triumphantly, and she laughed. They ordered another drink for him, and he sat down. Edouard looked Latino and was quite thin with a mop of boyish black hair which carelessly hung in a comma above his left eye. He was very good-looking, in a foreign kind of way, and wore chinos and an open-necked Sea Island cotton shirt in pale blue. He looked well-heeled, and Dodds wondered what he was doing working for Baptiste. He looked at us and waited for us to start the conversation. "Where's Charlie, Edouard?" Dodds started with. working on the premise of putting him under pressure. It didn't work. Charlie who? His voice had a rich timbre and a slight American accent. If I was you, I wouldn't mess around here. This is very serious. We want to know where Charlie is, what he was working on, what he had discovered and who killed him. I recommend you start talking. He looked at us both and smiled. Okay, so I know who Charlie was. So what? I've no idea what he was doing. All I know is that some big shot comes down from the States. He makes a beeline for Baptiste, and suddenly it's all hush-hush. I do know that he was interested in an item which was kept at the shop, but wasn't for sale. What was it, Dodds asked, feeling that at last they were getting somewhere, and suddenly the front of Edward's forehead exploded into Dodd's lap, followed almost immediately afterwards by the sound of gunshot. He leapt out of his chair and ran towards the sound of the gunshot while taking his Browning pistol out of its holster, while people were running away from the dreadful scene.
Moving on to my next question. Your last book, you speak about the world ending, Armageddon, but then you've gone on to write another book. Is that you playing with the audience or?
Playing with the audience. Well, I suppose writers do that anyway, but am I guilty in particular of playing with the audience? I suppose I am to a degree. I mean, I'm obviously aware of how the end of times goes back and forward through lots of different realities, and that is playing a lot with your audience. So, yeah, but I mean, what's wrong with that?
Well, it's very interesting to read, and it's good and stuff like that. However, it's just maybe slightly confusing as well to the audience with you doing that, maybe.
Well, I don't want to confuse the audience. Am I guilty of doing that? I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I don't think I confuse them, and hopefully, I write compelling stories. I mean, all right. So you've got the end of the world. I mean, spoiler alert. It isn't the end of the world, but I guess people would know that as it leads on to a new book. But, part of creating a compelling narrative is to make it challenging and go off in lots of different directions. And I'm surely that is the writer's job to do that. I mean, if nothing like that happened, it'd be rather boring, wouldn't it?
I suppose so, yes. And also with you writing your first book about, the world kind of ending in a way, was it your plan to ever move the books forward? Like, did you ever want to do that, or was it?
Well, initially, as I said before, it was just 6 books. That was the end. With Melville saved the world. Thank you very much indeed. Next job. But as I said, it ended. It was weird. I suddenly realised, well, no, that they can be immortal, and I don't know, the prospect of writing a wholly different new book across a huge saga of time, space, multiverses was really, if I'm to be honest with you, quite daunting. And suddenly I thought, hang about, I'll use this. I know these characters. I know what they would do. I mean, I knew that there was the whole thing about saving the planet, and there was all these opportunities. So, I mean, I've no apologies to make. Yes, I mean, to answer your first question, perhaps I do mess about with the audience, but I do it hopefully in an entertaining and fascinating way. And Armageddon did lead on to the science fiction series, and I know we're going to be talking about that soon. So that's my answer, really. I think that's all I can say.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So previously as we've spoke, you've called yourself Mad Dog. That's your stage name for these books of what you've written. And in these books there is a character called Mad Dog. Is that yourself? Are you putting yourself in these books?
No, even though obviously there's a great mistake. I should have been born a lord, but perhaps there was a mix-up at birth. But yes, I'm not a lord, where Mad Dog is a Scottish laird. And in fact, I didn't invent the name Mad Dog for the books. I've been called Mad Dog for decades, and that name was given to me by somebody else. Strange enough, it was I joined a new band and we had a gig at the Jazz Cafe in London, and I arrived in the first gig and there's a big sign outside with the name of the band featuring Mad Dog, and I thought they'd got somebody else, but it was me, and they'd named me Mad Dog. And later on, when I was with this band, and they wanted a name because I was somewhat outrageous on stage, I know it's hard to believe, I suddenly thought, well, you can call me Mad Dog. So I'm Mad Dog. I've been a band, Mad Dog and the Sophisticats or whatever, but I quite like the idea of having a Mad Dog in the book series because, I mean, Melville's first impression of him isn't particularly good. He comes across as an alcoholic idiot. I was completely a madcap, and so I thought, well, it's my name, but it's also his name.
Heading on to another excerpt, Armageddon.
A metal sphere hovered exactly 12 millimetres from the dog's nose. The dog in question was a young red setter puppy sprawled on its owner's garden on a sunny May afternoon. The sound of lawnmowers and sprinklers reinforced the feeling of late spring in the air, and the sun's warm balm of enriched energy fed those lucky enough to be out in the sun. The sphere, whose allocated name was Seymour, collated information on any temporal rifts caused by its journey through space-time. There were no temporal eddies, and the electromagnetosphere reported no anomalies. Seymour conducted a comprehensive self-check operation while monitoring the life signs of the dog. It registered its heart rate, blood sugar levels, and blood pressure, and became aware that the dog was in REM dream state. The paws, which were splayed out on the grass, were vaguely going through the motions of propelling the dog through the fields of corn. In addition to this secondary function, Seymour was also scanning the Earth for signs of the Pathfinder. It had been programmed with synaptic recognition software designed to pinprick anywhere in the world the position and status of the Pathfinder, and Seymour was immediately informed of the presence in Tibet of the life form known to him simply as the Susan. It was his raison d'etre to do everything in its power to look after the Susan and protect her at all costs, as it had been in its old life, in the future, and now in the past. It had to find the Susan here. Just finding her and knowing that she was safe provided a frisson of excitement within Seymour's quantum circuitry, thanks to his quark-centric programming. The dog woke up, but Seymour was way ahead of him and moved quicker than the eye could follow out of range of the dog's perspective. While doing this, it checked the air quality near the Susan and followed a comprehensive risk assessment which covered potential satellites which could impact the Earth and present risk to Susan. It calculated toxins in the air and realized, although there was already some buildup of toxins in the atmosphere, in comparison of where it come from, the Earth was still largely pristine and able to look after its ecosphere without considerable help from humanity at great expense. It realized many of the plant life and life forms which were extinct were now alive and thriving, and it marveled at how beautiful the planet was, entirely from an aesthetical consideration, of course. Seymour also calculated volcanic movement and stresses along all major faults, which had the power to affect the Pathfinder's health. It also identified any live threats to the Susan in her vicinity. The units near her seemed to be benign enough, so its next step was to quickly travel to her direction and attempt to make contact with her. Its programming allowed what was called deep synergy contact, which allowed it to access beyond the perimeter of her electromagnetic sphere, which allowed intimate and close contact with both Seymour and its future host. Seymour also checked the Susan's biometric life signs, blood sugars, sensory input, integration of data and motor output through the autonomic nervous system and cardiovascular data as it sped to her location. Once it reached a position diametrically above her position by 320 kilometers, it rapidly came to the conclusion that she was safe, but currently in stasis. His Susan had told him this may likely be the case, so Seymour felt no responsibility to act, except initiate a partial shutdown, so just his connection to her remained open.
Moving on to the final book, The End of Times, which I think personally is the most amazing sci-fi book ever, but just for the viewers, could you please remind them of who you are and why we're here?
God, you ask difficult questions. Who am I? All right. My name is Martin Jones, Martin Mad Dog Jones, let's be honest. And I am a trumpet player, vocalist, band leader, jazz musician, educator, writer, bon vivant.
Are you sure? Do you think that you're better than your characters?
Am I better than my character? Well, I sort of wrote them. I don't think bon vivant is somebody who's better. I mean, you found me, and I don't know how you found me in a restaurant eating. And I do, let's be honest with you, enjoy my food. Perhaps you can tell. And I have very expensive tastes that I can't afford. It's as a result of the life that I've led. I mean, it's in many ways done me no favours, but I call myself a bon vivant because I just find it amusing.
Okay. Going forward to the next excerpt, the reunion, Dark Side of the Moon.
No one was there to witness the arrival of the black box, an unimpressive part of the Black Eye galaxy, approximately 17 million light years from Earth. So really, it hadn't come from anywhere. It had just popped into being. One might surmise that it had materialized out of another dimension, that is to say, if anyone had been there to witness this, which was sadly not the case. If there had been someone there in the cold wastes of space, they would have had a job looking at it because it really didn't obey the laws of Euclidean physics. It just did not belong there. Looking at it, you would swear it had multiple sides, but as you would look around it, although it appeared to be a cube, there were no sides to it at all, and one could become quite queasy if one navigated around it. It looked like a cube, but one could not imagine how it came across as such. There would have been an intelligence to it discernible if someone had been looking at it, because 3 seconds after it arrived, it sped off towards a tiny dot in a distant galaxy, known to its inhabitants as Earth.
Mad Dog, how easy was it to go from Armageddon to the End of Times, including the characters and where they've ended up?
Well, as I said earlier, it set up the book, but I knew I wanted to create a saga that was a major project. It covered lots of different challenging concepts, what reality is, and strangely enough, I felt like a torturer, taking my beloved characters and putting them through hell. I don't think it was very difficult because, once again, they had more of a hand in it than me. It sounds very weird to say that, but they did influence me, and there was a lot. I mean, it's over 80,000 words. It's a major work, but it felt logical. I could sense how the characters were progressing and everything that was added, and it's layered upon layers. It's very complex, but at each step, the book Armageddon seemed to have set it all up for me. I realised how clever I'd been much later on, but who knows whether it's me being clever or not, I don't know.
And with the audience, did you ever think about how they would feel about the torture that you did put your characters through? Did you ever think, I wonder how people may feel about this and towards this situation?
No, I'm heartless. I'm only joking. Or am I? Well, what is the definition of a good book? As a good book is, well, I got up today and we had a nice meal out, and then we went to see Auntie Thelma, and then we went back and then we had a nice cup of tea. I don't think that's particularly exciting. Now, admittedly, perhaps, I mean, you've read my book and you've said some very nice things about it, but perhaps other people read it and think, oh my God, what are you doing to me? But isn't that the function of a book? A book isn't like the lives that we lead. We don't particularly want to live the lives of our eponymous heroes who go through literally hell, even though that may happen on a regular basis. But we don't aim to do that. We'd rather have a more relaxed existence. So am I forcing my audience to go through hell? Well, everybody knows that if a book's going to sell, then there's some kind of happy ending at the end. And every book that I've read, I've been dragged through the mill several times, but knew that it would be all right in the end, even though I was taken out of myself, and it was peril and danger that the characters which I'd fallen in love with, but it's part of the reading experience, isn't it?
I mean, I suppose, and would you say that your books have a happy ending, or would you say that they have a very, heart-wrenching ending?
Well, I mean, the previous series, everything ended up nicely. I mean, that was the idea. The thing with The End of Times, it's a very long book, and lots of things happen to the characters, and I can't keep inserting and they all live happy ever after a third of the way through the book. In real life, there are some conclusions, but like real life, there are other things going on which are concluded and are pretty painful. And so I suppose a good book mirrors our experiences in life, perhaps.
I suppose so. Moving on to another excerpt, 30 years later.
Stas Gimzo lived in a high-rise high-tech block in Los Angeles. He was an app programmer and had augmented the high-functioning autonomic system and various frontal lobe skill centers with synaptic enhanced implants, as well as enhanced visual stimulation and coding programming to give him and his many clients the edge, as he would put it, in the push and shove world of app development. Applications now were installed not in machines but direct into the brain. This was his area of expertise. As with everyone, his body showed the usual signs of lead, plastic and pesticide poisoning, which manifested itself in the constant symptoms of the common cold. In fact, it was one of the signs of being cool, and all the actors and celebrities now in the vid zone were portraying as having a cold. It was sick. You were a true 21st century citizen. He made his way past the rain-soaked streets under the dark and ominous skies of LA. I'll do that again. He made his way past the rain-soaked streets under the dark and ominous skies of L.A., and his security bot told him of an incident that was happening further on in his general direction. Fortunately, it was at the other side of the Voodoo Cave, his intended destination tonight, so the violence reported had no impact on his movements. It looked like a night of storms and high winds ahead, and generally venues had to dig down and away from the surface to avoid interference from storms and tornadoes to survive. While he made his way past the floating digital adverts, vying for visual hits to ensure they would make it on the SCO network, he looked at all the girls standing giggling at him. They were naked except for the clear plastic that kept them dry, with sex vids implanted on their bodies like elaborate tattoos, depicting them in the most obscene acts imaginable. It was clear what their plans were for this evening, but Stas had other ideas. He had been contacted by a Kim Croker, a legend in the app world, and could not miss this opportunity. Stas made it to the entrance, which featured a Jungle Drums hologram in front of the venue, made more vibrant by the effect of the torrential rain. It actually looked like a cave, with hologram bats continually flying out of it. He paid his $150 and walked quite some distance down and deep into the venue. It literally was a very deep cave, and by the time he entered the club itself, he realized it was packed. Sim pornography from the porn feed was depicted everywhere, at the bar, actually on the cocktail glasses, on the dresses of the topless girl waiters, and then a huge screen near the corner that hovered above the dance floor, which of course was just positions to stand with a series of electrode implants to jack them into the dance stream. A girl with massive breasts approached him. They were huge and obviously not her own. Stas noticed how much of an effort it was just to walk, and he wondered why people did this. He paid and brought his beer to some booths at the back, covered in fake tiger skin. The first booth was empty, like he knew it would be, and he sat there and waited to be contacted. An attractive girl dressed in clear plastic with porn vids on her stomach and her breasts jutting out provocatively sat next to him and put a hand on his crotch. She asked if he wanted a drink, even though he obviously had one already. "Fuck off," he shouted, and she got the message. It was quite an old-fashioned saying now. People generally these days shouted "clean," which was sort of the worst thing to say to someone. It meant you were not one of them. It meant that, disgracefully, you were not poisoned, and you were not paying your dues, even though you shared the responsibility for having destroyed the planet. It implied a perverse pride in at least paying the price with failing health. Stas looked up again, and Croker was there, as bold as brass. The same lined face, the same beard, the same cool look of someone who suffered in silence. "What's up, bro?" he asked. Stas replied, "Same old shit." They smiled at each other. Croker moved closer, and bizarrely, Stas could smell orange blossom on him. Croker moved to the back of the club, and Stas just followed him. The club was full now, but he didn't care. This was taking Stas somewhere away from himself, the himself he hated so much. They entered an office, and suddenly they were alone in silence. It rang in his head like 1,000 bells. They sat there and looked at each other amongst the floating couch and ubiquitous holosuites, and then Croker spoke. "What do you know about the world, Stas?" He looked at his black-lined face, the grey beard, and the sad eyes that plainly had seen too much in life, and wondered what game he was playing. "Just the usual. Hand of Destiny is protecting us as usual. There's peace throughout the world, and we are prospering. It's the same boring shit, man. Let's talk about app development or something," he asked, feeling that he didn't want to waste this moment and play his stupid game. Croker looked at him, and Stas felt that he was about to divulge the Holy Grail or something. There was a purpose in his eyes, and it frightened him. What have I told you, that half the world is under water? There's not enough food left to feed us. What have I told you, that the hand of destiny have not been looking after us at all, but leading us into a situation where we slowly kill the planet, and now we are part where governments are about to topple? Surely you're aware of the weather stars, the storms, the tornadoes. Surely you can tell that as a race we are now well and truly fucked, he said, while raising his voice to quite a crescendo. He looked at him in disbelief. Then he thought about what he had said. It felt like the first time in a long while where he actually questioned what was happening. And it frightened the shit out of him.
What elements did you want to include in your books, and how did that work out in the end?
Ooh. Right. Okay. I've always been fascinated with what reality actually is, what the fabric of reality is. Is there a God? What is the human condition? What do we want? And is what we want what we really need? Is there a God, and what God could that be? I wanted to think and produce huge landscapes that embrace audacious concepts and ideas, faster than light speed, travel, quantum entanglement theory, time travel, multiverses. And I just like the idea of things that are so huge. But for example, there's a God in the book, at least one, called the Caretaker, and it's so huge that if it didn't exist in black holes throughout the universes, multiverses, it would fill the entire multiverses and there'd be no room for us. I just like the idea of that. And I wanted the idea, I've always been interested in simulation theory, where in fact reality is some kind of training simulation. And there was some famous professor who said that reality is in fact a 3D simulation of a 2D reality. I quite like the idea of that, so I wanted to explore that. And I love the idea of there being a program responsible for each element. Like there's a program responsible for the Earth, and you can go back in, and get in touch with that program and reboot it, or talk with the program that's in charge of a universe or a multiverse or the entire reality construct. I had so much fun with it. I mean, I've always been a big thinker, a deep thinker, and it just allowed me to ask audacious and ridiculous questions and then provide some kind of answer. Something like that.
And you talk about gods. Would you say that you're the god of your series of books?
That's an interesting question. I suppose, in a way, all writers are gods of their own world. They're the creator of their characters and the world that they paint. Do I have a god complex? Good God, no. Pun intended. No, I suppose each writer does, is a god to a degree, but I don't consider myself in any way, shape or form being God. But it's nice to write about it. And I mean, in many ways I'm a super ecumenicist. I see truth in all religions, and I certainly respect religion, but I'm fascinated by people's response to it. And there's a part of the brain which is called the God Center, where we experience religious experience, and I'm fascinated by that as well. But if you want, I'm the god of my characters, if you like, but not really.
Do you respect your characters?
Well, if you could ask them, they might say no. Do I respect my characters? Well, I like them. I suppose I respect them, yes. I don't know what you mean by that, really. I mean, they're fictitious.
Say in the real world, you met them in real life. Would you have respect for them?
Yeah, of course I would, yeah.
Going forward to one of Martin Jones' next excerpts, the Unholy Trinity.
As we descended down the countless ancient stone steps, the temperature lowered, and I was grateful that I was no longer susceptible to temperature changes. We eventually entered the caves, and they were absolutely full of Gipluclians. I then noticed Professor Magnus and his small team hovering over a huge amount of equipment. I then saw Mr. Chu, Susan, and Yvonne close to the dripping green cave walls. Eventually, bizarrely, some chimes started, and it was probably the most purest sound I'd ever heard. I sensed a momentous moment, and I forced myself to relax and descended into a meditative state as I sat down in the strange-looking chair, which seemed to be made out of sort of fibrous rock. As soon as I sat down, I felt a connection. When I say a connection, I mean to say a connection with everything. I made a connection with every blade of grass and grain of sand in every world, in every reality. It was humbling, and tears ran down my face. I was expecting pain, and instead, I was experiencing ecstasy. Every single atom, photon, neuron, quark, etc., resonated with me, and I was one with reality. But then I sensed I wasn't at one with myself. I was the anomaly. And I realized that I could never be at one with reality until I was one with myself. The pain began then. I knew where I was going, but it was like an abomination to travel there as I was. I had to do something. I couldn't think because of the intense pain. I had to concentrate. Then I sensed my true master, and he told me what to do. It was such a relief. I then simply died. Every molecule in my body died, and I was no more.
Mr. Jones, where did the idea of the programme such as the reality construct come from?
Yes, I did mention that, didn't I? Well, it's a bit of a cheat. Writers are a bit of a cheat. They do cheat because they have to make a complex plot work. And if you suddenly put your characters through hell where they're at a point of being destroyed, and you're at this point in a science fiction book where God and huge things going on, like the darknet has taken over, how on earth can you make that all right? Well, you then have to resort to ideas such as, well, I don't know, if there's a reality construct, then why not a program responsible for the reality construct? And if there's a program responsible for the reality construct, which can be argued and have a logic argument with to try and get it to do something, then why not multiverses, different versions of us? Why not the universe, our own planet? And I used it a number of times when we've placed the characters in an impossible position, and all of a sudden, oh, Melville, our superhero, goes and does that. Phew. And then we can move on. Otherwise, it would have been a very short book. They all died. And as I didn't want to write a short book and I didn't really want to kill them all off, I needed some kind of device to save our heroes and go back a bit and reboot and start again, therefore saving the universe and carrying on. Does that make sense?
Interesting. Going forward to the next excerpt, Tempus Fugit, Search of the Cronus Device.
Deep in the recesses of the dark net, within the nooks and crannies in between millions of remnants of darknet unit souls, the mother rested and searched for her destiny. As one of the largest joined entities in the reality construct, she had an awareness which wasn't available to others. After her failure with Melville, she began to feel there was another anomaly which was very much more an opportunity for her to grow and achieve her destiny. She actually felt she had a destiny, and this has come about not randomly, but by design. To develop this, she stayed in the nooks and crannies and sent her awareness net out to discover where her saviour was and how it would manifest itself. She also searched countless memories for evidence of this anomaly she could find and join with it. She was trawling through one of these forgotten memories when she struck gold. The crack with the key. Even though she was perfectly aware of their demise at the hand of Melville, she learned that miraculously there was a prophecy that time somehow was manipulated and the crack returned and joined with the real Gucha to achieve a reunion. It talked of an entity living between two burning eyes and a river of death. It also talked of the Kronos device, and she gleaned where to find this device on the planet Yumu. She also realized exactly who would do such a thing: Melville. The mother smiled a vicious smile internally and began searching for what the two burning eyes and the river of death could be, as well as making plans to locate Melville and the Kronos device. An ice-cold feeling of evil intent shuddered through her ethereal body, and she began to look forward to a satisfying outcome. A very satisfying outcome.
So you've spoken about this caretaker, the god. You know, what does he actually do within this story?
Well, I'm not sure whether it's a he is more an it. Although the caretaker's role, well, the first time we discover him in the book, he is an ancient god of the Martians. They discover in this cave this temple, and all of a sudden Mr. Chu discovers the caretaker, and the caretaker is a being of light but occupies so much space it has to be held in the black hole. Now, the caretaker's role is to look after the reality construct to the point where reunification takes place, where all the souls within the reality construct are able to then move on to their destiny. And its real job is to help the Godhead, which ends up, to Melville's complete surprise, and I think abject horror, ends up being him. So the caretaker doesn't have an awful lot of power, if I think about it, but it's there to help things along and guide the Godhead. So even though the Martians viewed him as a god, it's not necessarily a god as we perhaps think of it in the normal terms, but it is certainly a device made by the first being, which is described as God and can be best described as Melville's father. But that gets us very complicated, doesn't it? But the caretaker is basically what it sounds like, is somebody helping to look after the reality construct to eventually achieve what is required, which is the reunification.
Okay. On to part 2 of the previous excerpt, Tempest Future.
Chu, the entity which incorporated the mother, looked through the memories of the remnants of every one of the trillions of souls which made up the darknet. He was worried. He sensed interference from the reality construct program itself. Of course, Chu had all of Mr. Chu's memories, so he knew perfectly well that the program was helping Melville and Susan. Upon reaching God status, the first thing to achieve is a knowledge of the limitation of your powers. He had realized immediately that the program was literally out of bounds to him. He could destroy Melville and the girl Susan and the other members of the Hand, but he couldn't touch the program. He sensed he was missing something and decided to glean as much as he could from the legend of the return of the Krark. He had stopped Melville's attempt to manipulate time, but this sudden rescue with the help of something he couldn't quite understand worried him. He would have to leave no stone unturned.
Mad Dog, what led you to rewrite all of these books into one?
Oh, well, yes, you're right. I did originally write it as a quartet of books, with the parts being actually the book titles. And I self-published it, but I felt that as a whole, the message that developed in the book, if I can say that, was important enough to be published properly, and I did some research, to be quite honest, and I knew there's a number of science fiction publishers who were interested in proper science fiction books, big books. So I thought, well, if I'm going to try and get a publisher, a science fiction publisher, then I need to rewrite all 4 books into one book, which sounds like it's easy, but it's actually really difficult because each book has a beginning and an ending, and there's references all the way through that work as one as 4 separate books, but doesn't work as one book. So it took me almost the same amount of time to do that, then write a book from scratch, to be quite honest. It was very difficult. In fact, I'm used to writing being easy, and this wasn't. What I decided, this will sound weird, what I decided was that I would actually view the book as if Melville at the end of time was somehow communicating to me what the book was, and so therefore I thought that'd be a good angle to try and sell, start the first chapter saying, I don't know whether you can hear this, but, and it appealed to me as a good way to write the book.
Interesting. Moving on to one of the last excerpts, End of Times Part 1.
Finding the physical place where the reality construct program existed turned out to be a really difficult thing to achieve. We were interrupted several times by darknet security sweeps, but the most difficult thing was Seymour actually accessing files that had been locked out of. It talked of temporal and protocol paradoxes, And having told the entire crew that Seymour was going to take us there and then just watch it do nothing was, to be honest, a little embarrassing. Eventually, after far too long waiting, it told me that it needed me to argue with its protocol adjudicator. I couldn't imagine what it meant, but he just told me to emphasize that this was more important than anything else, and it told me it would give in. Earth unit designated Mr. Neem. I have been programmed by the reality construct program. If you understand what this means, then you will realize how important it is that this unit designated Seymour is not allowed access to the files it wishes to gain access to. Can we agree on this and move on? It asked, rather arrogantly, Mr. Neem thought. Firstly, time has moved on, and the outcome your creator, the reality program itself, wished for is under great threat. I promise you that Seymour is right, and it is absolutely necessary, never mind what security profiles are in place, that Seymour be allowed access to these files. The whole rebirth and reunification, so dear to your programmer, is now under threat, and the only way this can be avoided is if you allow Seymour access immediately to the files it is required. I shouted, hoping that this would be sufficient. What you seek is very dangerous. Doth not your ancient rhymes have the truth of it? Goosey, goosey, gander, whither shall I wander, careful not to catch a tiger by its toe? What you propose is dangerous to you all. However, Seymour will be allowed this information, given what you have told me, it said mysteriously. And then Seymour was back. Seymour presented me with the coordinates, and I made a thought order to the helmsman, and within seconds we were orbiting a very strange planet, glowing in an eerie mist. We took a thought pod fighter out of the hangar and followed Seymour's direct instructions as we descended towards the surface of a grey planet obscured by cloud and fog. We bizarrely parked where an unremarkable semi-detached house disappeared into the fog. We got out, and the first really disturbing thing was there was an alarm so loud emanating from the house that Mr. Neem thought his ears would explode. With their hands desperately plastered over their ears, they gingerly walked towards the front door and opened it, as there was no way anyone was going to hear them knocking. As they walked into a room, a knight in armour stood with a sword in one hand and a mace in the other. Before anyone could say anything, he chose to bring the sword down upon Mr. Neem's head, or at least that would have happened if Seymour hadn't melted it with his laser. Stop, we come in peace. We desperately need to speak to the reality construct program. The reunion is in danger unless we speak with you now. We wish you no harm, Mr. Neem said. And suddenly the alarm stopped, and the resulting silence was louder than the alarm. I know it's obvious that the Kronos device has broken, and they're deposited somewhere in a different timeline. This is a problem, but there's an even greater problem, Mr. Neem started, and the strangest conversation he had ever had ensued.
What is Melville's message?
Well, I mean, Melville is a construct of my imagination. So I suppose Melville's message is my own to a degree. It's more or less saying that we're all connected to each other, and life is not supposed to be a holiday. It's actually some kind of a training program, and as much as life can be challenging and difficult, I think his message is that it's supposed to be. I mean, if we read a book and by the third chapter it says, and everybody was happy and nice, I mean, who would read the book? And if somebody, and let's face it, most people want something in life, and a lot of it's to do with winning the lottery. They want to live in the Bahamas. I mean, you can go on a long holiday, but what do you do then? I mean, what is life without the challenge, without purpose? It's just stagnation. It's just a non-existence. So, I mean, I think people come into life and they have these unrealistic expectations. I know some scientists recently discovered the secret to happiness in life. I could have told them the answer anyway, because they said, reduce your expectations. Well, of course, that's what you do. People expect so much, and it's usually what they want is the last thing that they really need. Life, I mean, I've faced considerable challenges in life, and it was pretty horrible to go through them, but at the end of it, I felt stronger, wiser, certainly more confident. I'll tell you a story. I had a student a few years ago, and he had cerebral palsy, and he was in a chair, and electric chair, and wheeled about and communicated by moving his head slightly. So his workload was about 20 times more than anybody else. And people felt sorry for him, but he did really well. He got merit, and he went on to be an entrepreneur. And I was in the discussion in a debate, and I knew what the answer would be before he answered it. But I asked him, to the horror of the rest of the class, if somebody came up with a pill that suddenly says, we've got a cure for your condition, you can get out of the chair and lead a normal life, what would you do? And people looked at me with horror in their eyes. And he said, and it took him a while to respond, he said, why would I do that? I've paid the price to be me, and this is who I am. Why would I destroy that? And that stayed with me. And I just think, you know, life, as much as it is challenging, and, you know, we lose people we love, and that's horrible, and we become ill, and there's mental illness, but every horrible thing that happens to you, I believe, and Melville believes, that's his message, that comes with a gift. It comes with a gift of experience, of a context that arms you for more things going wrong, that allows you to help other people, that allows you to grow. So I suppose life is a spiritual journey. And if people realise that, and that, God, life's shit at the present moment, I wish it would go away, actually thinking, God, this is a challenge, what can I do? How can I get through this? And then suddenly find the courage and the will to be able to do it, that, for my limited experience, means that you become stronger, you become wiser, and therefore you can help other people. So I suppose that's Melville's message.
Thank you. Thank you. Our last excerpt, which is the reunification of the very odd thing.
I awoke from a sleep which was unusual for me. Even though I could sleep, I generally didn't bother. But I did recognize the feeling, and for some reason, I found it disturbing. In fact, there was a feeling of dread within me, and I literally couldn't work out what was going on. It felt like a disturbance within me, like my DNA was being reprogrammed. Not that I had any DNA in there. I moved to get up, but realized that I literally couldn't move a muscle. I had gotten into the habit of breathing again because, to be honest, I quite liked the experience, but I realized that I also wasn't breathing. A dreadful noise like a chainsaw started in my head, and I began to get very worried. I called out inside my head to anyone who would listen, but no one came. I was alone. The next phenomenon to occur was a restriction in my vision. I was losing my eyesight. Was this the death that we were waiting for? And where were the other godheads and their trillions of souls? This felt like a lonely death, and I was truly frightened. The noise got louder and louder, and then my body started shaking uncontrollably. I suddenly felt incredibly full. This was impossible. I couldn't have all this inside me and go through this torment. I wasn't ready. I could feel Susan, Mad Dog, the mother, my father, in fact, everything was inside of me while I shook uncontrollably in my bedroom. Talk about embarrassing. Then, molecule by molecule, my so-called perfect world crumbled out of existence, and I was prostrate in the vastness of chaos, feeling about as bad as I'd ever felt before. Then chaos was sucked out of existence, meaning I was hung in nothingness, and a bright light emanated from the distance. I still couldn't physically move, but I found if I willed myself closer, it came closer to me. It was an old-fashioned television screen from the 1950s. I thought it closer, and Cliff Richard was singing congratulations in black and white on the television. I tried thinking a coherent thought amongst this madness, and the picture abruptly changed to an American TV program where a mouse was singing to another mouse. The lyrics were very interesting. I am you and you are me. I am you and you are me. Repeated non-stop. I then tried saying, what happens now? And the television flickered, and suddenly George Michael was singing Faith. I painfully laughed, and the TV went off. That was it? That was my communication with the new entity, which would be us. That was the catalyst for me to give up everyone's life voluntarily because a 1950s TV spoke to me in old media clips. I don't think so. I sensed now that the time had come, but I wasn't convinced that this was right at all. It seemed such an odd way to communicate. As I diminished in dimensions, I made a map of everything and prepared to recreate the enormity of me in denial of the reunification. Then everything stopped, and I was sat in a rail carriage moving through India, it seemed. The hot, dusty air made the carriage uncomfortable, as well as the journey across the many points on the line. Elephants were walking on a dry riverbed as I looked out the window, all linked to each other with their trunks and tails. The sun shone inside the small carriage like a furnace. There was a faded, dusty grandeur about the carriage itself. Seemingly it was old Victorian stock, so I placed the train in either the 1920s or the 30s. I looked across me, and there was a young man dressed very formally in a black morning suit, and he said, "How do you do?" Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm okay.
Yeah?
This is Martin Jones, the famous writer of the George Melville mystery books. Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it. It's been nice talking to you and getting all this information.
Same here. Thank you very much.
Actually, if you don't mind, can I ask you just one extra question?
Sure, yes.
You've spoken about Melville and his message, and you know that you think that he's using this device to try and get in contact with you and speak to you. Why don't you just be honest? What do you really think? You know, what is your true, honest opinion?
What is my honest opinion? All right. Although how this will sound, I have no idea. I just feel from the very beginning that Melville has somehow or other been instrumental in guiding me through all the books, but increasingly, certainly through the end of times.
Do you believe he's tried contacting you? Do you believe that he's the one that has influenced you on everything? You believe he's been there from the beginning, before you even had the idea of writing the books?
Part of me does. And it sounds ludicrous. And I mean, the thing is, I've miraculously built up a good reputation. And lots of friends. I don't quite know how I've managed it, but I have. And I'm equally aware, as I'm discussing this, that me admitting that I'm receiving communication from the end of times in another dimension, instructions on how to write these books, they think I'm a bloody lunatic. And so, as much as I want to think that it was me, I mean, Paul McCartney dreamt yesterday and is still earning royalties from it. Was that him, or was he listening to the superconsciousness or the whatever from the ether? How much of what we think of in our creative, artistic bent is truly ours? I'm probably trying to rationalise my argument, but I feel strongly that Melville has somehow or other communicated with me. But I'm not saying that has influenced all my life. And I think that I've had these ideas and beliefs that I've developed through my life. And I'm not suggesting that he was instrumental in those, but perhaps because I was of that mindset that it was able then to actually connect with me in some way through the superconsciousness. So perhaps, well, it seems to me that Melville has been communicating to me, yes.
Do you think maybe like in a past life, in a different multiverse, that maybe you were Melville and you've been born into this present and tried telling his story?
That's a very interesting question. If I'm to believe the context of the books, which we can say have come from Melville, then I hope not. Because Melville has achieved his rebirth, he's achieved the reunion, and is about to move on. So, I mean, I don't want to... I mean, who knows about rebirth and who I've been in the past. But I don't think I've been Melville. I think Melville has moved on. I mean, the end of the book is whereas at the end of times, but you then think, well, what happens at the end of times? Well, I guess, I mean, the whole premise of the book is that we're all actually creatures of light and frequencies and all different frequencies, and the frequencies get higher until eventually perhaps we forget who we once were and move on. I mean, it's funny because in the book, Melville's father says to Susan, I think, that Melville is very goal oriented, and that's one of his weaknesses. And what you really should be doing is actually enjoying the journey, because the journey is much longer than the end and much more fun and much more rewarding. And it's interesting, as I teach people, I almost feel envious of where they are starting out, because I know how excited I was in seeing how my playing improved, how I got a sheer buzz from getting really good. I mean, I became obsessional about practice. I was practicing 8 hours a day. I tell my students that, they don't believe me for a second. And now when people are starting off or even halfway through, I'm sort of envious because I don't have that kind of buzz anymore. And so, going back to your question about Melville's message, I think actually what we should be doing now, in spite of all the crap that's happening to us, is actually do our best to enjoy it.
My final question. Do you believe that there is a future for your books or for the characters that are in your books?
I hope so. Yeah. Can I just ask you a question? You've been asking me all these questions. I'd like to ask you one question. I don't want you to say anything yet, okay? I'm going to ask you a question, and either you're going to do one of three things. One is you're going to nod your head, which means you agree. Option 2 is that you don't move your head at all, which means I could be right, but you're not in a position to say. Mm-hmm. It's like, you might think so, but I couldn't possibly comment. And option 3 is where you shake your head. I might say, because this has been a very bizarre experience for me, I'll be honest with you. I still don't know who you are, except weirdly, I've got a bizarre feeling that I do know who you are. And if that was confirmed, that would help me enormously. So, the nod your head, stay still, or if you have to, shake your head. It's a very weird question, forgive me. There is one character left that hasn't moved on in my book. And that's the character of Susan, who leaves part of herself with the reality construct, which I presume we are in now. Remember, nod, don't nod or shake your head. Are you Susan? That's a nod. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I use the video? Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where it'll go to, I have no idea, but I appreciate what you've done.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here. Goes a long way. Thank you.
This is one of the most weirdest experiences of my life. No offence.
You don't say.
Although, I don't think it's the most weirdest of yours. Thanks very much.